Hi, everyone. Hope everyone had a lovely lunch. It's a great privilege to be able to moderate this last final session of what has been a fantastic conversation. So the panel is called A Future Digital. For all the hype from Silicon Valley and Bangalore, in many respects, the digital future bears a striking resemblance to the analog past, which is interesting given that we spoke about old-fashioned technology in the morning, remediating the old tensions of coloniality, caste, and extraction. Alternative, speculative, possible practices of technology, a future digital, offer visions, prototypes, and demands for a more just, reparative, and emancipatory worlds to come. And we are very fortunate to be hearing from 5 speakers today who will be touching upon those worlds. And our first speaker is Dan McQuillan. Dan couldn't be with us in person today, but will be coming in over Zoom and has a fantastic display picture. Dr. Dan McQuillan is a senior lecturer in critical AI at Goldsmiths, University of London. After a PhD in experimental particle physics, Dan worked with people with learning disabilities and mental health issues, created websites with asylum seekers, ran social tech camps in Kyrgyzstan and Sarajevo, and worked for Amnesty International and the NHS. He is the author of Resisting AI, an anti-fascist approach to artificial intelligence. Over to you, Dan.
Thanks very much. Just to check, you guys can hear me okay?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, that's good. Right, I'm going to try and share some slides to start with. Okay, are those slides showing up?
Yes, yeah, all good.
Great. That's 2 wins in a row. Fantastic. Okay, yeah. Well, firstly, obviously, I'd like to thank the organizers for the chance to be part of the panel, and I hope to stay for as long as the discussion as I can manage. But anyway, my short opening contribution is called A Future Digital, if there is such a thing, means overthrowing AI.
Yep, that works. Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to do the lo-fi version of a slideshow. Never mind. Yeah. So, if the digital future resembles the analog past, whether it's AI or the next thing to come, it's because of the continuities in relations of power. Technologies like AI amplify abstraction and align with the hierarchical dualisms like misogyny, racism, and a contempt for nature, which underpin our existing so-called civilization. Now, AI is presented as the most transformative technology of our times, even by people who want to reclaim it for alternative political projects. But seriously, the unreliable production of word tokens, the conditioned denoising of image prompts, these can't possibly justify the immense strategic and financial commitments which we see pouring into AI. So what's really going on? Oh, it's working now. Fantastic. So I suggest that instead of confusing claims about computation with very real structural transformations, we see AI as a diagnostic of a system in crisis that's trying to restructure itself. Now, Canada's Carney admitting at Davos recently that the rules-based international order was always a sham, and DeepMind's Hassabis saying that scaling large language models is a dead end, both hint at the same underlying crisis of legitimacy. So rather than believing AI narratives that present it as some kind of endpoint, suit the arrival of superintelligence, we can interpret it as a technology of the interregnum, the gap between one dominant social order and the next one. As Gramsci pointed out, an interregnum is a time of monsters and morbid symptoms. And mainstreaming AI's abstractions helps to reawaken the latent theological and fascistic elements within our existing social logics. Like fascism itself, the AI apparatus is both dumb and capable of shocking violence. It distracts from real causes while producing subjects to blame, and segues from bureaucratic cruelty to eugenic solutionism.
Recording in progress.
Okay, recording in progress. And just like fascism, it wants you to believe that it's inevitable and unstoppable. That seems to have, recording in progress seems to have stopped my slides working for some reason. There we go. So the neural networks at the core of what we call AI operate in the same way as the capitalist economy, in that they're incapable of even simulating progress without continuous growth and acceleration. The material demands of AI and the global rash of data center buildouts are revitalizing the fossil fuel industry. This is an aerial shot of XAI in Memphis showing the gas turbines. So it's revitalizing the fossil fuel industry and the imperialist credo that burning as much energy as possible is the route to worldly power. The convergence of ideology and infrastructure is what ultranationalist Ernst Jünger called total mobilization, meaning the conversion of life itself into energy, as nations are driven relentlessly to seize matter, movement, and force through the formalism of technoscience. The question of how to respond to AI is a way of asking whether we want to keep repeating the same historical mistakes. AI isn't inevitable, but there's no going back, because our systems were already structured on injustice and already heading for planetary burnout. Reacting to Silicon Valley accelerationism with calls for tech nationalism is simply to reproduce the patriarchy as state technology. But the seemingly inescapable immiseration of an AI everything world is also an opportunity for Luddite politicization and the development of a more liberatory technopolitics. My response is to propose decomputing. This rejects scaling because that drives carbon emissions, but also because our collective agency is undermined by our immersion in a system of machinic relations. Decomputing is the way. Imperialist extractivism is re-legitimized by technology's endless expansion. It suggests that a bare minimum for digital systems to be consistent with a degrowth agenda. Decomputing calls for de-automatization, which isn't simply about escaping algorithmically mediated relations, but about re-establishing situatedness and relations in place, which are the long-standing practices of countering extinction that indigenous peoples have never forgotten. Like a disability justice perspective, decomputing aims for the dismantling of infrastructural arrangements that construct marginalization and deny self-realization. Decomputing borrows from a convivial approach to technology for its fusion of the capacity to hack, for the mutual obligation to care, and because it gives us ways to collectively assess tech's effects on relatedness and on bio-interaction. Decomputing is a response to what I call infrastructural intersectionality, the recognition that the varieties of collateral damage generated by advanced computation settle most heavily on the already disenfranchised. The same communities who will experience power cuts due to local grid overload or breathe polluted air from the data center turbines are also exploited in jobs where they're precaritized by AI or targeted for fraud accusations or for deportation. AI focuses our attention on social ecology. That is the fundamental link between environmental and climate crisis and the exercise of arbitrary power. As climatic events intensify, we will all need community hubs with resilient power and water connections. So we should be making plans now for when the AI bubble bursts and we get our chance to occupy the data centers. More broadly, infrastructural intersectionality is about building our own infrastructures, ones that support caring for each other without the compulsion to filter and enforce categorizations. Decomputing is intended to be a prefigurative technopolitics, which tries to enact change relations in the here and now through assemblies like people's councils, which organize resistance to AI in ways that can also transform the participants. These structures are the foundations for wider socialization, where we make shared decisions about material and social resources. The current attention on the environmental harms of data centers actually poses the question of how to re-socialize all of society's energy and water resources. AI isn't worthy of attention because it's an epochal technology, but because it's a snapshot of global restructuring in computational form. What AI models show us is a future we don't want to live in. But it also throws back the curtain on the fragility and panic that is its real energy source, the fear that hierarchies of gender and race might not last forever, that armored subjectivity is a delusion, and that we are all vulnerable and completely interdependent. A future digital, if there is such a thing, is a feminist apparatus that doesn't have its roots in Silicon Valley, but in Rojava or the streets of Minneapolis. A future digital, if there is such a thing, won't come through agentic AI or masturbating over Maltbook, but through self-organization that reclaims collective agency over the means of social reproduction. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Dan, for that stirring call to arms, in a sense. Okay, so our next speaker is José Magalhães. I'm so sorry about the pronunciation. José is a writer and an academic from Brazil. They hold a PhD in legal theory from the Pontifical Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro and are currently a research fellow at ICI-Berlin. José's research works at the interfaces between speculative juridico-political theory, technology and ecology. Their broader project draws on modified readings of legal thinkers Hans Kelsen, Eugenie Pashukanis, and Carl Schmitt towards a heuristic for mapping and navigating not only the non-modern, but also non-human, technological, ecological, spiritual, juridico-political orders. Sorry for that. Would you like to take over?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. I'm going to try to get through these slides as quick as possible. I have some notes to make that easier. So my small presentation is called Cosmotechnics and Platform Geopolitics, China, Brazil, India. And this is an overview. I would like to draw a problem space rather than make a proper argument. And I will start by introducing the context of platform geopolitics, namely how tech platforms have become geopolitical agents interacting with states in various ways. I think that's already transpired in different ways in the previous presentations. I will then introduce Yukhoi's concept of cosmotechnics, according to which different cultures have different conceptions and implementations of technology. I will then speculate. I'll show how Hui understands modern Western cosmotechnics as well as his treatment of Chinese cosmotechnics. I will then speculate beyond Yukhoi about what we might conceive of as Amazonian cosmotechnics. And I would like to finish by opening up the question of how we might inquire about Indian cosmotechnics and what might be its role in this era of platform geopolitics. So this last part is less something that I'm going to talk about than something that I would like to open up as a question for us to discuss. So first, platform geopolitics. You've seen this picture yesterday already, and well, probably many times before. My work at the intersection of juridico-political theory and media theory has been largely concerned with how platforms have recently become key participants in planetary politics and governance. In the beginning of last year, these guys were lined up at the inauguration of Donald Trump's second mandate. And little more than a year later, Trump has not only disrupted the global economic order to a certain extent through his tariff policies, but also disrupted the global political order through a series of geopolitical moves, such as the intervention in Venezuela and the manifestation of the will to quote unquote acquire Greenland. So to many, it might seem incomprehensible why the United States would want to undermine an economic and political order that they themselves, more than anyone else, have put in place, maintained, and profited from, an order that pretty much corresponded with their own global hegemony. But here's a hypothesis. Perhaps some of these actors had arrived at the conclusion that a transformation of world order is about to happen necessarily, and decided that the best way to position themselves at the forefront of this next world order would be to actively accelerate the disintegration of a previous one. That is crucially having in mind the idea of a race for this next order, one that necessarily has contenders, the main one being, of course, China. Such a transitional epoch poses the question of what is the role and the destiny of other peoples and countries, such as Brazil, or more broadly Latin America, where I am from, or such as India, where we are now. While this question will often be posed from political or economic perspectives, what I would like to do here is to frame it more in terms of the intersection of technology and cosmology or metaphysics by deploying the notion of cosmotechnics. So, cosmotechnics. The concept of cosmotechnics was developed by Hong Kong philosopher Yuk Hui. Its implication is that different civilizations or peoples have not only different cosmologies, but also different cosmotechnics, different concepts of technologies connected to their specific cosmologies, as well as different technical ways to make their worlds. In Hui's definition, different civilizations have different ways of mediating between the human moral order and the cosmic moral order. Hui is influenced by the so-called ontological turn in anthropology of thinkers such as Marilyn Stratton, Eduardo Viveros de Castro, and Philippe Descola. This tradition has often focused on how different cultures schematize differently the distinction and the connection between society and nature, represented by these icons. What Hui does, in a sense, drawing from philosopher of technology Gilbert Simondon, is to turn this into a triangle, asking how different societies draw the distinctions and interconnections between three poles: society, nature, and techniques. So let's start with the modern Western cosmotechnics. In its basic form, we might say that modern cosmotechnics posits technology as a causally determined instrument that mediates the relationship between humans as free agents and nature as a causally determined resource. Hui wants to provincialize modern cosmotechnics by showing that there are other different cosmotechnics. His prime example is Chinese cosmotechnics, which he traces by reviewing Chinese thought about technology all the way back from Taoism and Confucianism up to modern Chinese communism. For Hui, Chinese cosmotechnics positions technology as a mediator between the human moral order and the cosmic moral order that is different from modern cosmotechnics, because here nature or the cosmos is not understood as lacking a moral, axiological, or normative dimension analogous to what we find in human society. Instead, human moral order is placed in the context of a larger cosmic order, and technology is a way of tuning the resonances between those two moral orders. I should note that Hui does not claim that the current Chinese cosmotechnics, that the current Chinese platform stack expresses what he considers as Chinese cosmotechnics. He argues rather that modern Western cosmotechnics was able to unilaterally globalize itself, not only in capitalist forms, but even also in communist contexts, communism being another largely modern phenomenon. Now I would like to move from Hui's own thought and explore more this idea of Amazonian cosmotechnics. Hui doesn't study that himself, but he shows an interest in the hypothesis of an Amazonian cosmotechnics in his conversation with Brazilian anthropologist Eduardo Viveiros de Castro. Although their conversation itself seems largely frustrated, I believe that it draws some interesting lines that can be further developed in pursuit of reconstructing a concept of Amazonian cosmotechnics. In works such as this book, Cannibal Metaphysics, Viveiros de Castro is famous for proposing a style of anthropology in which indigenous thought is brought into play at the same level as Western philosophical and anthropological concepts. I am interested in inquiring about Amazonian cosmotechnics by interfacing Hui's idea of cosmotechnics with Viveiros de Castro's engagement with indigenous thought, as well as with indigenous authors such as Ailton Krenak and Davi Kopenawa Yanomami. So, to simplify it a lot, what seems to emerge as a paradigm of perspectivist cosmotechnics would look like the following. As usual, techniques mediates relations between the human and the non-human. However, these positions of human and non-human are not established from a universal God's eye view, as they were in other cases, but rather they vary according to different perspectives. To speak more concretely, non-humans, such as jaguars, see themselves and their kind as people, while they see humans as non-human entities, paradigmatically as animals. Inasmuch as animals see themselves as humans, and therefore as having culture rather than nature, we can assume also that they would also have their own technical artifacts. In a famous example, what humans see as blood, so part of nature, jaguars see as beer, part of their culture, but also a form of technical artifact. If humans use a bow and arrow when they go to hunt, jaguars too have their own bow and arrow, even if it appears from a human perspective in the form of fangs or claws. Now, the next step would be that technical objects themselves are sometimes held to be people. A shaman's instrument, for example, which shamans use to navigate perspectives and talk to non-human spirits, are often considered as having personhood. That, of course, implies that these technical persons, inasmuch as they are people, would themselves have their own artifacts and therefore technical objects. This creates this fractal effect, as the artifacts would also have their artifacts, and so ad infinitum. This produces what, in my opinion, is an extremely elaborate philosophy of technology that is radically different from both the Western modern and the Chinese paradigms we saw before. crucially, it detaches technology from reference to the human, not by excluding the very idea of humanity, but by making it at once ubiquitous and perspective dependent. This conception of technology allows Amazonia itself to appear as a huge technological assemblage, not in a univocal sense, but in the sense that it is the product of a network of relations between humans and non-humans, some of those relations being juridico-political, others technical. One interesting aspect of this for me is that this is not only the kind of small-scale technical bricolage that would be usually attributed to indigenous peoples, it is a planetary-scale assemblage, a real piece of geoengineering, or rather, geobricolage. I'm interested also, although this I think is a very delicate question, on what kinds of assemblages could exist if this kind of Amazonian cosmotechnics were also combined with other technologies. In such cases, it would be crucial to see that everything is not reduced to a modern instrumentalist cosmotechnics, but rather that modern technical objects are recontextualized through non-modern, in this case, Amazonian cosmotechnics. So to finish, I would like to take advantage of our context to open up this question, which I don't think I can say much about what would this question of cosmotechnics look like here in India. I think it's important to underline in this context how delicate and even dangerous this question can be. I think one problem that I have with Yukhoi's own approach is that he tends to speak in terms of civilizations having their cosmotechnics. So I feel that he's dividing the cosmotechnics at this very large scale, which risks ignoring the fractal internal differentiations within these cosmotechnical clusters, so to speak. I personally prefer to speak in terms of different peoples, which I think is something that can be more granular. And as with all kinds of nation building, there is, I think, a real danger that talk of Indian cosmotechnics, in this case, could be associated with reductive and violent simplifications, as we were talking about before. I'm sure that this assortment of icons that were tagged as associated with India is quite representative of this kind of simplification, cliche, and so on, as all kinds of like iconic reductions will tend to be. So, for instance, just arriving here a couple of days ago, I saw there's going to be this big AI summit from 16 February here in Delhi. And on their website, they were talking about the 7 chakras of AI. I don't know what they're doing, so I can't do, a proper critique of that. But I'm almost certain that this will probably be less a real cosmotechnical paradigm than some kind of just marketing gimmick of some sort. But I think that doesn't necessarily mean that any talk of different metaphysical frameworks for technology is necessarily useless or harmful. But I would mainly like to open the conversation with you guys about how this question concretely takes shape in the obviously extremely diverse and complex contexts of what we call India, and to maybe start a conversation from there. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, José, for that. Like this gesture towards the capaciousness of technologies, which I don't think we've been talking enough about. So thank you so much for that. Okay, our next speaker is Puneet Jain. Puneet is an artist and researcher working at the intersection of human-computer interaction, HCI, extended reality, AI, and disability studies. Puneet's artistic and academic practice challenges the ableism embedded in XR technologies, an umbrella term for virtual and augmented reality and wearable interfaces. He is currently intensively engaged in hacking and modifying XR technologies to make them accessible to people with disabilities, particularly his friends with spinal cord injuries, tetraplegia. Puneet works closely with disabled artists and activists using adapted, accessible XR technologies as artistic strategies to tell immersive stories that challenge common stereotypes about disabilities. He is currently a doctoral student at Concordia University, Montreal, and a research fellow in the immersive art space, Zurich University of the Arts, Switzerland. Puneet.
Hi. So I would like to open the discussion around my PhD research, which I'm doing at the Immersive Art Space in Zurich, Switzerland, and also Concordia University in Canada. But then I want to anchor this talk on a current obsession of mine, which is, which you can see in yellow color, the mouth. So I've decided to, organize this presentation into 3 parts so that I become organized. It's just for that. So part 1. Should I bend down to see him face to face? Where should I look? I could witness the saliva drooling from his mouth. I really felt weird. Maybe I also felt awkward. I wonder, was I embarrassed of my own able-bodiedness? Soon, all these feelings dissolved at the locus of something very uncanny, the orifice, the opening that closes on itself, the mouth, Christian's mouth. Push, move up, down, rotate. His chin continuously moved the joystick. I saw Christian past me in his wheelchair. Disability scholar Rosemary Garland Thompson says that in encounters with another person, a tremendous amount of information must be organized and interpreted simultaneously. And encounters between the disabled and the non-disabled specifically are strained because one may feel fear, pity, fascination, repulsion, or merely surprise, none of which is expressible according to a social protocol. So I wonder if there is something that mouth wants to tell us or scream back at us. Mouth that produces gestures, mouth which drinks a cup of coffee, mouth through which different entries arrive, mouth through which one can find the start of the body, mouth that orders its puzzle and hence its technopolitics. So I want to start by sharing this advertisement by a company called Meta, formerly Facebook. I mean, Chris already talked about it a lot yesterday, but then I want to specifically see this advertisement critically by observing what are these companies dictating to us when they show these advertisements. How do the bodies move in space and time? And if you see it clearly, it's all very exaggerated motion. Bodies have to continuously be expansively moving. They have to hold the headset to wear it. And then you have these 2 handheld controllers which come with often with all the head-mounted displays that you have to, move the joysticks and the controllers. And then the company says that if you cannot use these controllers, just use your bare hands. And this is because they have this new computer vision technology, which is called hand tracking, which means that it can track your fingers, it can track the space between your fingers, and then you can actually see your hands in the simulated space. And what I find is interesting is also all these white YouTube enthusiasts then follow up and they're like, oh, VR has peaked, it will change how we interact with the virtual space now. But then none of these gestures work with Christian, who is a very close friend, lives in Germany. He's also our colleague at the Immersive Art Space. And he's an artist and lives with spinal muscular atrophy. That means he has no upper and lower body movements, which also means he cannot pick up these controllers. He cannot hold these devices to move. His disability also doesn't allow him to move his head, which completely boils down this idea of immersion by these companies, because they want you to move around. If you cannot rotate your head, it's all dead. So, and But then it's not like Christian doesn't use technology. He uses all the assistive devices. He uses one mouth control joystick in his daily life. I mean, he was in India last week. He went to Kochi Biennale, and then he uses his mouth control joystick, which he has self-hacked using a straw. Because he has a lot of straws, because he wants to drink a cup of coffee. He cannot drink a cup of coffee with his hand, so he uses a straw. So he has hacked the joystick. He has put the straw in front of the joystick so that he can move the joystick using his chin, which moves the wheelchair, and then he can move around. And the way Christian moves in time and space is something which has been invoked by many disability study scholars. And I would like to read this quote by Anna MacDonald, who's no more, but she was a very good advocate for people with communication disabilities. She says, like, I live life in slow motion. I have cerebral palsy. I cannot walk or talk. A slow world would be my heaven. I am forced to live in your world, a fast, hard one. If slow rays flew from me, I would be able to live in this world. I need to speed up, or you need to slow down. And this notion of time is described by disability scholars. They call it crypt time, which is this notion that when you are disabled, or like basically all the bodies perceive space and time differently. And when you're disabled, there is another notion of that time that kicks in you, like also like clock time, but also psychological time. And this is also described by very famous disability scholar Alison Kafer. She says that rather than bending disabled bodies and minds to meet the clock, crypt time allows us to bend the clocks to meet the disabled bodies and minds. And this is again raised by Ellen Samuels in one beautiful article in which it's called like 6 ways of looking at crypt time. And one of the ways to look at it, she says, like, crypt time requires us to break in our bodies and minds to new rhythms, new patterns of thinking and feeling and moving through the world. It insists that we listen to our body minds closely and attentively while also pushing it beyond the limits. So thinking about this and being with Christian for like, it's been 2 years that I know him, and like we spent a lot of time together. So we were thinking, like, why all these companies that produce these XR devices has not thought of bringing people like Christian in these kind of virtual spaces. So it was a very basic question asked when we were having a coffee, and coffee will, be a recurring theme, like while I'm talking. And then he said, like, can I use my mouth to move in VR? So we started a process. So I want to discuss this process. It will be a lot of like technical jargons, but I'm sure you'll follow up. Like, so first we thought, like, okay, Christian, the thing with Christian is like, because he cannot move his head, so he cannot have any point of view in VR except the point of view which he looks when he puts the headset. So the very basic question came to our mind, like, how can we rotate his point of view in VR? That is the physical, that is the computer generated space. So we started, using these small, like very old, not small, like facial recognition algorithm. This is called the face mesh landmark detection algorithms. What they do is, like, you put a camera in front of you and then it can track 478 coordinate points on your face, which means that you move your head in the field of view of the camera, it will still track. But we didn't need all these points. What we were thinking is that if we can track the points on the mouth, we will be able to detect if Christian opens the mouth or closes it. And if he opens the mouth, we can rotate the virtual space a little bit, and then he can see, 360-degree way. We were able to achieve this, but then we ran into this problem, that all these algorithms are very hungry for eyes. They want to see your eyes, only then that they can detect your face. So when you put a headset on, these algorithms would stop working. And then we were thinking, like, what to do with this. And then this idea came along, like, it's like always Angelina Jolie's face helps, because you just, do a paper cut and then you just put it on the headset, and then it juxtaposes Angelina Jolie's eyes with the lower face of the wearer, and it still works, and then you're able to, capture the face. And so this is something is also being called by disability scholars like these. So it's like hacking the algorithm, not like building new algorithms, running new training sets for the mouth, which most engineers would do, but just hack it simply and you'll be able to do it. But then we got a little bit obsessed with it. So we started building mouth interfaces. So these are like, and also I have to give a shout out to like this Hive lab at IIT Kanpur, who has been helping us like building these mouth interfaces. It started with me, and then I realized I need a group of engineers to build very robust mouth interfaces. So what you're seeing here is like, it's a headset, and then you see a device which is just protruding out of the headset. And this is a camera-based device, and it tracks your mouth. It doesn't track your face. It's just like is super obsessed like me to the mouth. So it tracks a certain type of gestures, and these are the kind of a small set of gestures that it can track. It can track if the mouth is open. It can track if your cheek is puffed, which means left cheek puff, right cheek puff. It can also detect if you're moving your tongue out. But the question is, why do we need it? We were thinking, if we can have these gestures, and this is like Eric Desrosiers or another friend and collaborator who's using one of these mouth interface, what it does is that doing all these small gestures can enable Eric and Christian to just move in the space. They can just open the mouth, and then they can move forward in virtual space. They can puff their cheeks, and they can rotate in the virtual space. And these are like small gestures to do this accessibility on the basis of already excluded headsets. But then after building it, we were also thinking, what are we doing? Are we just finishing off a task that Meta couldn't finish? Are we just building assistive technology, and then what? So we thought, like, what if we reimagine how, and it took us a lot of time to figure it out. We were stuck into this idea of what we have built, because, okay, we are able to like move around in the virtual space. We were able to interact with VR. But then also it's funny because these headsets are costly, and I mean, I used to have a headset, so Christian could use the headset. So this politics also comes into play. Christian doesn't just even need the headset. So the idea became like, let's build up a provocation, and this provocation goes against Meta, in which like, okay, if you like, we don't need to use the hands, we can just use the mouth. So we started creating this artwork. That we called Trip Sensorama. And this goes back to the history of Sensorama, which Chris had a genealogy yesterday, but then 1962 is where there is one more point where the Sensorama device built by this American filmmaker, Morten Hellig. And so we are just clipping, and I know like I have 2 minutes, so I also have to show a video, so I'll run fast. Maybe I'll just close with the video of the artwork to show how the artwork was staged and what we are trying to do with the artwork. So.
That does not conform to the norms around the world. Like,
can you fix it? It's muted here. So we were thinking if we could stage the mouth interfaces in terms of artworks. So two people sit in front of each other, and they're in this big, humongous mouth.
Normally it helps to have handles, but I don't need the handle. especially in the context of disability, it also reinforce stereotypes.
Have you ever been in a close encounter with a disabled body?
So I just want to end up with just 1 minute of describing why this artwork. So yes, we were thinking about provocation. But then the questions that we were interested in are how can these assistive devices become our artistic strategies to not only serve inclusion for corporates, but instead expose that exclusion? How can we use this mouth interface to tell disabled stories and restage encounters between the disabled and the non-disabled in a way? The normal and the freak. And that's why we created this artwork like Trips and Sarama. So, and then I just will leave with this. So this artwork could not have been created, this is not only me, it's Christian Bayerlein, it's an Argentinian artist, Jessica Duarte, and then Eric Dorozier on the screen from Montreal, Canada. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm never going to look at my mouth the same way again. So our last speakers are Stefanie Wuschitz and Patrícia Reis. Stefanie Wuschitz is a data research artist based in Vienna. Her scholarship generates data that shapes her artistic output. She investigates the entanglement of gender, technology, and power. Her degrowth-inspired artistic method entails upcycling, salvaging sustainable, locally sourced materials to create ecofeminist interactive art installations. Her drawings and animations explore new forms of storytelling, knowledge transfer, and documentary. Patrícia Reis is a Vienna-based media artist and researcher whose practice explores human and more than human entanglements with technology through feminist hacking, sensory interaction, and embodied interfaces. Her installations investigate touch, consent, and care, often inviting intimate, active participation. Seeking to subvert visuality as the dominant mode of experience, she employs physical computing and haptic art to expand corporeal perception. Her work is marked by the combination of contrasting media and materials, spanning ceramics, sculpture, photography, video, and interactive systems.
Hello, thank you so much for having us. Patrícia and me met in a feminist hacker space, queer feminist hacker space we organized together for several years. And the objective of that space was to demystify technology of gender bias. And then we made a new endeavor 10 years later to not only demystify tech, but to kind of try to decolonize tech. And it might sound pretty impossible to do, but we are artists, so we can just imagine that we're doing it without doing it. So that's what we try to do with this project. And it all started with actually breaking into broken devices to see what's inside. And what's inside is usually very, very valuable, even if most of it ends up after 2 years on an e-waste pile. It's gold, it's lithium, it's nickel, it's copper, it's a lot of things that are wars are done over. So it's actually something you all know. It's an open secret. And when we look at all these things that are inside, they are pretty much old colonial products that travel with supply chains that have the same roots, like old colonial roots, just that it's now not gold for a crown, but it's a gold that's maybe in your laptop or in your smartphone. So all these minerals and conflict minerals are coming from mines, and there's not like a fair trade mine next to a normal mine that you could choose from, but there's just usually one mine. And it's usually one big monopolistic mining company like Freeport-McMoRan for gold and copper, and for example for lithium it would be Rio Tinto. So there are not many mining companies, there are a handful, like big tech. So this extraction and this extractivism has many faces in this life circle of technology. It comes first of all with the exploitation of land and exploitation of resources, and then exploitation of human labor and grabbing of fossil fuels in order to power the machines that make it. I mean, that's what we were talking about for 2 days now, so you don't need to. And in the other direction, the e-waste goes back into the countries where many times the mines are robbing the land of the resources. So many times after only 2 or 3 years, these devices contaminate land and initiate a new circle of colonialism through contamination of land. But we met a lot of friends who in different places in the world are really working on these issues for a long time, and they have many small initiatives that try to do repair or recycle, upcycle, or invent new forms of making substances from fermented materials or from materials that are organic or ubiquitously available. So we were really inspired by these friends, and we were doing the whole thing in the pandemic, so we had a lot of calls with them. Milton Rage in Cuba and Saad Chinoy in Singapore, Gameli Atsao in Ghana, and Rashina Shrestha in Nepal, and many others. And they inspired our work. So we tried to come up with feminist, ecofeminist hardware. So why would we do hardware? You cannot use any AI without hardware. You need a chip, you need a hardware to process the data. And we kind of, why feminism? Why feminism? Why feminism? Okay, so feminism, because our interpretation of feminism is based on a concept of care, that you try to maintain things and keep them alive, and also care for, of course, the people who care. And also, it's an important principle of our interpretation of feminism, consent, that everyone involved is informed and consents, agrees. So we try to restrain ourselves or restrict ourselves to only use hardware or make hardware that is following this principle of care and consent. So in the end, we said, okay, although we in Europe have, and we are very privileged because we're at the art university, we have all these beautiful, shiny things, but we said, no, we're going to not use them. We're going to make hardware that is living up to our care and consent standards, which would be that it has this non-human, human, animist, and feminist new materialist approach, that it has no high impact on land. It's non-toxic, that people who are making it are treated fairly, that we use as much recycled materials as possible and existing materials or urban mined materials, and that the means of production are actually something that is not cutting edge, but is something that is accessible everywhere and for everyone on the periphery and not in the metropolis. So we made this mini manifesto, which was really hard for ourselves to live up to, as I said, without mining in harmful ways, environmentally friendly, under fair working conditions, from available materials and without generating e-waste, and with these principles of consent, love, and care.
Yeah, so urban mining was, of course, one of the alternatives we tried. I mean, now we move a little bit to practice, and we show some of the final results, which are not really solutions, but rather like speculative proposals for feminist hacking. So we look into urban mining, and as you might know, urban mining is done at the moment by two main ways. One way is by buying your used gold. So I've seen in India a lot of these shops, right? We buy your gold. So that's the easiest way to do it. If you have some gold, they melt it and transform the product. The other way is much more complex, which is, it demands like very sophisticated industrial processes by trying to take the gold and these precious minerals out of your electronic devices. So we didn't want to do any of it. So the first we were looking actually into where in the world can we find gold. And
Where around us?
Around us in our environment. So we don't lie about where we come. So we come from Europe, and we are based in Central Europe. And we both inherit some of these porcelain sets through our female lineage of the family. And some of them we also actually found in a very cheap price in flea markets. So they are a very collectible, or they used to have this collectible value. They somehow went out of trend recently, I think, because they are not also compatible with our industrial dishwashers. And after some time, the gold comes off. So you can find them actually very cheap in flea markets in Vienna. So we also we thought about, okay, we can maybe use the gold from this porcelain. We have to find a way, obviously, but also we were thinking and inspired by these sort of tea and cafe saloons. So they were more segregate female sets, mainly for middle high class in the 17th, 18th century, very famous in Austria. And it was also a moment, I guess, an opportunity for these women to share their secrets. So our installation is actually called Salon of Open Secrets. And it was, I think, also a space for sharing knowledge, right? So we look at it as a bit as a hacker space or safer space in these times, and of course in a very privileged set. So they would share stuff like, for instance, how to avoid pregnancy. So it was also through porcelain, and we don't have so much time to go through it to talk about the gift economies, but also it was through porcelain that some of these privileged women in the 17th, 18th century emancipate themselves to art collectors, because somehow it was not in the interest in the male sphere. So we look into the porcelain sets we had. We knew this gold was conductive. We wanted to use it in the circuit. We had to have some control of it. And in order to have control, we analyze, or we had to also dig and try to understand how is this gold applied in porcelain. So it's a third fire. It's called lustering. So with porcelain, usually you have a raw fire, which is very high temperature, and then you have a glaze fire where there's even higher temperature, and then a third very specific curved fire where you apply this gold, and it stays there forever, more or less. So we basically look into the materials we have, and we either added gold to conduct electricity where we want it in our circuit, or we carefully removed part of this raw gold so it's not conducting into the circuit. And what we did was tablecloth hand embroidered circuit. So it looks like this. So we designed the circuit, and we thought about we're going to have this round table for 4 people to interact with it. We attached some controllers. They are audio controllers. And by moving these porcelain vessels and around, we can trigger different buttons in the circuit, and with that trigger sound. So this is just an example from one of our... there's no sound. Maybe I try again. I got it.
No, otherwise it's echo.
So in this case, we attach a light sensor to the porcelain that we managed to solder in, and whenever the cup is lifted, there's a sound being triggered. So we also, from our practice in the hackerspace, usually everything we do is shareable, open source. So we do manuals for all our art projects that can be downloaded in our website. And this is how the table looked like. And we could trigger these different sounds. So the sounds we collected for this installation, so we presented in different formats. Either we had it for the audience to participate, sit on the table, have a conversation, share some secrets, or we had also opportunities where we could do a performance. So we had pre-recorded sounds, and these sounds were also from coffee, drinking, environments, but also very much inspired in this idea about coffee and gold as colonial commodities, and also some of the our collaborators, experters, mainly from the Global South, contributed with some thoughts about the project. So these are some pictures from a performance we did in Portugal in a Biennale of ceramics. So we were the only artwork that didn't really offer something new in ceramics. And we are both not performers, so this is also important to say. And we collaborated with two great performers, local performers, Ana Rita Carvalho and Sofia Amado. And I would like just to show a short video, which is like a summary of, I think, 1 minute of the performance. So. So there's no water inside, no liquid.
I think we see technology a lot like, magic. It's something that someone else has done. We're basically consumers of it. We don't make it, it happens to us. So we move our life around what it gives us.
So it was an earthquake at the end that we produced with a loudspeaker under the table.
Yeah, so it has a little bit of a witchcraft vibe. That was the idea. I was told we had a bit more time, because I think so.
Let's just be really fast.
But I tried to be as fast as possible. Yeah, problem we had, indeed, if we want to follow our manifesto, was that we're still using an electronic device, which, although it's open source from Adafruit, which we really like them, it's still not according with our ethical hardware standards. So we really wanted to go and try to develop, again, a tool that could be also an artwork that is somehow more sustainable possible, or at least according with our feminist hacking standards. So we come up with the clay PCB. It's now in exhibition at Khoj. Please go and look. And the way we come up with, and the way it's called clay PCB, is because we want to inspire the other makers and artists to actually do PCB using the same methods. So we look to what PCB is made of. So we have conductors, non-conductive, and semi-conductive components. So we all know a lot of different conductive materials. And we do also non-conductive materials. We looked into porcelain already, but we also know that all kind of clay is a non-conductive material. So we look to a specific kind of clay, which is wild clay, which is, we just found out it's not new for India, but quite new for us Europeans that usually buy clay in a block from a company, and we have no idea where this material is coming from or where it's mined. But we came across a work of craft a person that is expert in ancient techniques of making clay. So we did an intensive workshop with Heinz Lackinga. We were in the forest. We learned where in Austria we could collect clay, how to identify soil from clay. And so it was a very haptic process. And also we collected with our hands, we also molded, and then we learned also how to fire it in a bonfire, so without needing the need of electricity. So how to urban mining electronics? So we were really have a lot of people working across the world on permacomputing communities. So what they do is they collect and recycled components from old electronics. And since we were part of a hackerspace and we used a lot this famous microcontroller Arduino, we were able to collect this microcontroller chip at Mega 328. So we had a lot of them available, and we thought we're going to use it in our circuit. So our clay PCB is actually a microcontroller board. It has several inputs and outputs, so it's already pre-programmed, so you need a computer to indeed program it. We also need the electricity to function, but it can compute inputs and outputs. So we also come up with a 3D printed stamp, so we could stamp the circuit, and we could use urban mined silver paint that we found from a company in Germany that is actually collecting silver from silversmiths. So it has leftovers, has dust. So it has to be really painted by hand. There's no other way. Stenciling, there's too much waste. And only after this painting, we can actually fire it directly in the fire. So I really would like to show this, because we were talking about so much about how to automate somehow all our labor, right? And this is indeed something I think machines and AI cannot do, because you really need to be in the place and need to be aware of the nature. You need to have your tacit knowledge of your body in order to be able to actually make something like this, because you change the environment, and also you have a different kind of clay, you have different wood, you have a different temperature, and all of this is something indeed that you don't learn in the book, you only learn by an embodied experience in the place. So this is our PCB. I guess we can stop here then.
Okay, I think I might have to stay here because I have to also include Dan in the conversation. But thank you so much this panel has been absolutely, I think, a perfect end to conversations that have been both optimistic, pessimistic, utopian, and dystopian. And I think the presentations today have kind of helped us to think about different ways in which we can move forward. I think I'll open it for questions. So yes, if we have mics going around the room. Ali.
Hi, thank you. Just to echo Padmini, this feels like a perfect conclusion to a kind of a context of how to move forward, given the kind of conversation that we've had over the 2 days. And I'd like to, it's open to the entire panel. This idea of augmenting that we've been talking about right from Christopher's presentation, it seems that both with the clay PCB and the previous works that you have done, and also Himanshu with your work, this idea of augmenting to existing technologies to make shifts in techno-poetic and techno-diverse spaces is seeming to be a way to kind of move forward. And could you maybe talk about what are things that you are planning with these projects next?
Are you asking everyone?
Yes.
Yeah, Puneet, do you want to go?
Yeah, I really believe that working in collaboration with other people in a participatory way, with networks of solidarity, and also with parallel computing, is for me also a way to move forward and kind of subvert these extreme capitalist relations that we are forced into.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, because we didn't have time to conclude, but indeed it's about degrowth, right? So I think we have this urge, which we have to stop and use what we have available in order to, instead of just bringing new resources or using new materials.
I'll just say like what I'm thinking like right now is like, so after we made this artwork, we ran into a new problem, is this empathy problem. Because these devices have been very well known they have been called as ultimate empathy machines by this American filmmaker, Chris Milk, in a TED talk. So everyone who would come to see the artwork would at some point might assume that it's a way of like being in someone else's shoes. Like you put the headset on and then you can be in Christian's position. So for me now, and also Christian and Eric, the question has been to how to refuse empathy. And why I'm saying, because it might seem problematic, but at the same time, in context of disability, empathy becomes very closely related to pity, or feel like, okay, these bodies are broken and these needs to be fixed. And what we are really interested in, like, new encounters. So like the next stage is like thinking about these kind of encounters.
I don't know. I don't know what to say. I feel like this question probably applies more to the more applied, more concrete practices as a very like theoretical presentation. I'm not sure how to respond to that, and unless you want to, I don't know. But yeah, I would just save the time.
Dan, would you like to add anything? Yeah.
Well, a bit like our colleague, I wouldn't say this augmentation is exactly my question, but I would like to say, whatever it is, it should definitely be anti-fascist.
Great, thanks. Yes.
So my question is to Stefanie and Patrícia. Interesting, the clay PCB. I like the concept. It made me think of this one. When you were showing this, the tea drinking activity that was being shown, and it made me remind of this one text that I read on Gautam Bhadra on imperial tea, as in the act of tea drinking itself in India is very colonized and is very, it's rooted in the European culture and the etiquettes. So it's more like when you were talking about the clay PCB, there was this aspect of decolonizing. Like the decolonize, it is an eco-feminist decolonized hardware. So I wanted to ask that how does clay PCB, if you would elaborate, how does the clay PCB decolonize hardware?
I mean, I think what didn't come across with the coffee table is that all this sound was actually testimonies of friends who were in different places in the world and tried to do more ethical hardware, or were talking about this issue. So we tried to invite them to the table basically with this, and also we tried to disrupt this whole colonial connotation of sugar and coffee and gold by having this earthquake in the end. But yeah, I mean, we just showed a really short thing out of 20 minutes performance. And yeah, of course, it's impossible to decolonize technology at the moment, I think. And also to make something from recycled and upcycled urban mined things is not possible because you cannot get identical pieces in the garbage. So it has to be produced in a way so that you can disassemble it and make it into something else, like Lego pieces. Otherwise, at the moment with the surface mount electronics, they're glued and you will destroy them when you take them off. And that's on purpose, of course. But the old devices we used were still so big that you could, with a screwdriver, just take them off.
But if you would try to really make a circular ecology, you would have to produce things that are from cradle to cradle, able to take apart again in pieces that are from one substance and then use again. Yeah, this was just an art project. It was just, yeah, not working.
So I just want to actually take this opportunity to ask maybe José and Dan, that I feel like what kind of comes across in that previous question is kind of context and contingency, right? Like how transferable are certain concepts, how well can they work effectively all over the world, even though they all seem incredibly promising. So I wonder whether you could possibly address that. Maybe we can start with you, José, and then Dan, if you'd like to respond.
So you mean how concepts can be transferred from one context to another,
so
or
yes,
not?
Yeah. So in your work, when you were talking about the cosmotechnics that can, so say an Indian cosmotechnics.
Yeah.
I mean, what kind of alterations or contingencies, which you did kind of gesture at the end, like the kind of risks of that as well, because an easy transfer also has implications. How do you imagine it might be?
Yeah.
As well?
I think the sort of methodological part of this ontological turn in anthropology that is part of the theoretical sort of basis of what I'm trying to do, both in political theory and also in this kind of media theory context, is interesting because it sort of presupposes that translation is at once impossible and necessary, that you're always, that even within the very local contexts, even the indigenous peoples themselves that are in question, they are always sort of translating each other's concepts, and they're often more interested in exogenous sort of symbolic elements than in sort of like repetition of sort of like self-identifying elements. And I think it's very elegant and interesting how then these authors turn anthropology into this kind of device for mediating between heterogeneous conceptual apparatuses and contexts of practice and world making, because then it becomes a sort of general comparativism. I tend to think that it's a very limiting attitude when we say you can't compare these two things because they're different, because I think the whole point of comparison is comparing things that are different. If two things are the same, then there's no point in comparing them. So, what I would say, I don't know if this answers your question, is that I think what Khoj does has a limitation in the sense, I don't know if you've noticed this, like I sort of left that in the presentation but didn't point to it, but like when his first general conception of cosmotechnics appears, his general conception is a mediation between the human moral order and the cosmic moral order. And then when he does his study of Chinese cosmotechnics, he says that Chinese cosmotechnics is characterized by mediating the human moral order and the cosmic moral order. So sort of his general concept of cosmotechnics is an extrapolation of his case study. And I think that's actually interesting in the sense that when you go then and through his dialogue with Vives de Castro, you look into this hypothesis of Amazonian indigenous perspectivist cosmotechnics, you don't find only a type of cosmotechnics in Khoj sense, you find also another concept of cosmotechnics in the sense that the question then is no longer how do we mediate between the human moral order and the cosmic moral order. It becomes more a question of how do different humans or different peoples, because you're sort of starting with the assumption that all entities are peoples, even the jaguars, even the forest, even blah blah. How do they mediate? So it sort of fractalizes the concept of cosmotechnics itself. So I would say that the way to not act like you can simply have like a general category that will apply everywhere, that will just you can take this concept and just throw it at another context and another context and another context, is precisely this kind of comparative method where each context sort of provides a new kind of singular projection of the whole context. You know, the whole context is sort of refigured around the every new sort of point of view from which you're posing the question. So I think that if you're going to then, you know, move it to India or whatever context you want to establish it as a standpoint, then the whole sort of conceptual apparatus would have to be sort of refigured around that.
Right. And yeah, I think maybe goes back to what we were saying yesterday about the naming of things and who names them. Yes, Dan, would you like to?
Oh yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, you know, definitely one of the threats of technology in general and AI specifically is, you know, an extension of this universalism, this view from above that's so core to science as well as technology. You know, and it's clearly arose, I don't know, about 500 years ago at the same time as empire, because it can't separate it from a way of legitimizing, really, a kind of expansionist, infinite growth perspective on the world, really. So yeah, that is a problem, but we definitely shouldn't take that stuff as, I mean, looking for clues in sort of relative context, not take that stuff at face value, at its own statement, that it somehow got rid of religion, because I think it's important to pay attention to, for example, the secular theologies in most of Western Enlightenment thinking that is really just a kind of a translation of religious authority. You know, because clearly one thing we have to take into account, as well as being anti-fascist, is theocratic fascism. I mean, like, in my opinion, Hindutva or any other form of theocratic fascism around the world. And this stuff is very alive as part of the current restructuring. So the thing I'd say about this relativism is that I absolutely think knowledge in place, related situatedness, that has managed to cling on, you know, in the face of this expanding empire, is absolutely vital for future knowledges. But there are elements that are present almost everywhere, it seems to me, in particular patriarchy, in one form or another, that has to be tackled without overly respecting the idea of traditional knowledge systems. Something like that.
Great, thank you. How are we doing for time? Can we take 10 more minutes?
We have 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes, great. Yeah, McQuillan.
Can I? Thank you for an inspiring panel. Each one of you in different ways kind of like get me thinking that the way to rebuild from capitalism is saying, I have enough and I am enough. So my question is for Dan, and I'm thinking about for example, if there is, or if you think there is a way where can AI be constructed without being ethical and without being under like fascist terms. And I'm thinking about the CyberSyn project in socialist Chile by Salvador Allende and how that was cut off. And I think there may be some alignment between like thinking about a socialist AI and ecological AI.
Yeah, I think that a lot of AI was done to undermine hierarchies, but it was in the hands of evil people, becomes weaponized. I don't think AI is intrinsically evil at all. Many weapons that use AI are actually made to not kill as many people, but they were hacked in order, or weaponized to kill even more people. It's insane. So I don't think that AI could not be socialist. I think AI could be socialist. Like in Austria, we have an AI algorithm that sorts out who will get unemployment money, and actually the algorithm would tell which person is already marginalized in order to help the person, but the Austrian states use it to marginalize these people even more, which is like, what? But it's on purpose by design. So I think actually, yeah, get rid of evil people, save the world.
Yes, Dan, I think, did you want to add something?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, I fundamentally disagree with the last point. I don't think there is I don't think it's very helpful, actually, to look at AI as simply a tool or something that's taken over by bad people, or a good tool that's taken over by bad people or something like that. I mean, obviously it depends what we call AI, and that's a kind of empty signifier. But I try to be very specific at what I mean by AI, which is, well, the main kind of AI I'm concerned with is the one that's so rampant at the moment, which is, I'd call it connectionist. It's based on neural networks and so forth. But, I think a lot of the critiques also apply to wider forms of machine learning, particularly as they're mobilized by institutions in that kind of way. And my critique of them absolutely does come from their fundamental, resonances between their concrete computational operations and their social and political effects, as everything does, because as above, so below. You have resonances at all levels. So it's not like I necessarily think, if you notice the title of my talk is called If There Is a Future Digital, it's not that I necessarily think that all computational technology would have these particularly toxic qualities, but I'm not sure. But I certainly think that it would need a completely different framework from which technologies can arise in order to answer that question. So the kind of things I'm interested in are things like convivial technology, approach V van Illich, because I think that offers something actually which draws from a lot of the kind of hacking, sort of ethos that people here, and not us theorists, but people here have already, made such a great display of. I do think that I'm interested in Stafford Beer, not because of CyberSyn. I think that was like a centralized operation, really, of a kind of traditional centralized socialism sort of way of doing things. But I do think there's been a lot since that, Stafford Beer's ideas in general and those things, the sort of lost cybernetics resonates really strongly, actually, with the movements of, let's say, the 2011s, the movements to the squares, the so-called Arab Spring, and more recent events. And I just want to mark today, because I find today is a very sad day, because I think it is more or less the end day of a social experiment in northeast Syria, which was explicitly, led, women-led form of horizontalist democracy. So I think those are the kind of matrices, in literal both sense of the word, out of which it's possible to think of the possibility of technologies that are non-fascist, but the ones that we have explicitly need to be thrown into the bin and recycled or something.
Thanks. Maya, did you have a question? I'll go Maya. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So,
okay. Maya, someone else, and Shuddha.
Yeah. So I have just a question and maybe a suggestion for José. I come from a philosophy background. So my question is more towards the philosophical side of your presentation. So the picture that you presented of the Western what was the word? Cosmotechnique is of course in one way true, that of this instrumentalist view of technology in which nature is being there just for the use. But I think in our age of this, decolonization and all of these in fashion, but I think in this somewhere we get the West, so-called West, gets essentialized as this monolithic entity in which we have just this one tradition in which this instrumentalist way of seeing the nature and that I think is historically and culturally perhaps incorrect, because there is in the West itself other traditions which diverge radically from the picture that is usually presented, and the one that was seen in your presentation as well. So here I'm thinking of, for example, of, let's say, Hegel, Feuerbach, and Marx, and let's say Marx's idea of social metabolism and the metabolic rift. So all of those things in which nature is not seen as just merely as an instrument or a resource to be exploited for our human purposes, but nature is there as a basic essential precondition of human life itself, and has to be interacted with in a way that the nature itself is preserved, and while being in a kind of harmonious relationship with human beings. Now, of course, that changes with capitalism. There's comes a metabolic rift, as Marx calls it, but nonetheless, there is a tradition in the West as well, which goes against the picture that is usually presented. So that's my suggestion, maybe to look. There are intellectual and philosophical resources in the so-called West, insofar as there is one, to issue and tackle with these things. I'm not against going to non-Western thinkers and traditions, but my only suggestion is that the West is not so monolithic and essentialized as one usually, and that's the That's like a danger that I think should be avoided. And the question is, it's a small brief one. So the theory that you presented of social ontology, I have not read much about in the literature in that field, but the idea that I get that it's more of a descriptive thing. So, okay, so there is this view, there is that view, there is that view. But my question is, but what makes one society or culture adopt that view rather than the other? So is there an explanatory part to the theory as well? Can the theory accommodate give an explanation rather than just described, in a enumerative manner, that there is this view, that view, and that view? So yeah, that's the question. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll try to answer very quickly. I think the main thing is just the fact that we are all talking in a very contracted way here, because we're coming from very different backgrounds and have very small time to expose ideas. I have no notes on your suggestion about the modernity. I do agree that it is much more complex, just as the other traditions that are sort of schematized there are also extremely more complex. I tried to make my presentation sort of very explicitly schematic, so as to not even make anyone think that it could possibly be that simple. That's partly why, formally, it is presented in that way, this icon, that icon, and a line. I'm using this sort of explicitly simplified language to sort of make it very clear that these are very broad abstractions that are extracted at the cost of the grain from their respective contexts. Viveros de Castro himself is often even criticized for the fact that his reconstruction of these indigenous ways of thinking are done through the resources of certain secondary sort of underground traditions of modernity itself. For example, he uses a lot of Deleuzian vocabulary. He's very strong on Lévi-Strauss. So it's not a kind of pure distinction between those different traditions, but it's sort of just a way of trying to grapple with those differences. And then the second question was about what? Sorry, can you say? Oh yeah. I would say that there's a correlation always between certain schemas of practices. So what you observe sort of ethnographically in terms of how societies organize themselves versus the sort of implicit, or to a certain extent explicit, metaphysical apparatus that is correlated to that. I think in that tradition there's an avoidance of this kind of infrastructure-superstructure relation, where you would think that the superstructure isn't somehow secondary or downstream from the infrastructure. I think those two things are seen in this more kind of double bind, where they are both different but mutually conditioning, which is, I think, inspired by this kind of seismogenesis idea from also anthropology, where you have those two poles that are different but they condition each other. So there is a part of that, but it's not a kind of materialist reductionism or economicist reductionism, if that's the question. Yeah, but thanks.
Okay, so we're running out of time. So what I would suggest is, Shudha and Maya, if you can just put your question out, and then Mila can wrap everything up. Thanks. Shudha, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Because of time, I'm going to make this really crude and basic, but the divisions between speed up and slow down, all of you kind of speak to that in some way, or rather actually all of you speak about kind of a return somewhere, whereas everything else around us is not accelerationist, but just kind of moving ahead and wanting to actually embrace a lot of the technologies that are out there. The other is sort of, and this is a provocation, is the making and doing with the hands. It's not actually a blueprint for making anything except solidarity or ways of being or sort of coming together. So I don't think that decolonization is actually a thing you can do, but a place that you kind of move towards. So I actually was kind of productively troubled by the thinking about the future, because there's this kind of, I like Dan's word in the beginning, the interregnum, because it's a kind of speaking to the pause and actually, are you moving or not? Anyway, I'm going to stop there because I don't know what I'm saying anymore.
No, I have very briefly something not really substantial to say, but I'm following from what you said. I've always maintained that the term artificial intelligence is a bit of a misnomer. It should be called applied statistics, which is what large language models really are. And insofar as they are applied statistics, they do in fact distill what is already produced by human minds and human labor, right? So I find, in the sense that everything that we do with an artificial intelligence engine is based on the training and the model building that has been done through all of human intellectual activity from beginning till now. So in that sense, it is part of the accumulated labor power that becomes capital, but it is actually labor. So I do think there is a possibility for a socialist or applied statistics, if it takes into account that thinking with labor about the labor of the past, thinking with labor about the labor of the future is always a possibility. And if we take with any amount of seriousness the forgotten idea that the real intention is not to do away with the division of labor, but to do away with labor. That human beings need to be liberated from labor, not into kind of eternal unemployment, but into eternal coming together of the realization of the human faculties. We will never be able to do that without applied statistics.
Okay, on that note, letting the stochastic parrot fly free, we'll end there. Thank you so much, and thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you, Dan.
Wow, that was a fantastic panel to close us out today. And I'll keep this really brief, but you know, when Khoj invited me to work with them on this symposium, I was sort of partly kind of at a bit of maybe projecting some personal frustrations, let's say, and onto sort of the broader world, and kind of feeling troubled by a sort of broader lack or sort of insufficiency of engagement with the digital or with sort of our sort of networked computation in the artistic and cultural worlds in India. In retrospect, that was clearly a stupid thought, and I think bringing together this symposium has proved me quite wrong on that front. I would like to thank all of you for having joined us today. Thank you to Pooja. Thank you to Khoj. Thank you to the Goethe Institute, the British Council, SSAF, and Pro Helvetia. Thank you most of all to our speakers and our keynotes. I'm very inspired by the last couple of days. And like many people in here, I also kind of wear another hat, which is largely in tech policy at this point, where one is more sort of in the weeds of really deadly conversations. And so this sort of last 2 days have really felt like a respite and a sort of space to sort of gather strength and inspiration and to speak across sort of so many various registers and worldviews and so on. I'll quickly sort of draw out some brief points that really kind of stuck with me. And I think our keynotes really did an amazing job of sort of framing the overarching shifts that are taking place today. You know, always socio-technical, but also really centering sort of technical and operational changes in our regimes of perception, in our legal structures, our epistemic frameworks, our sort of very embodied relationships with our senses, what creativity and authorship mean. And it's clear, I mean, to use that word from Dan again, it's clear that we're in an interregnum, right? We're in a sort of time of monsters in that Gramscian sense. And sort of so many of our sort of taken for granted regimes are shifting. And so I think really Chris, Ashish, Michaela, Nishant, and Maya have sort of given us the beginnings of a language with which to make sense of some of what's happening and to turn it over, to make it tractable somehow. To see that maybe some of the doors that we're constantly knocking on are actually closed, but maybe that there are openings elsewhere and they need to be built in sort of places that are familiar often and sometimes unexpected. Some of those places, I think, really for me were the body and the kind of sense of embodiment that sort of has grounded so much of our conversation here. Sort of tacit knowledge, sense making, which technologies are constantly trying to replace but are also dependent on throughout. A set of spatial questions really stood out for me as well. Where sort of all of these large infrastructures are depending inextricably on physical space. They're coming up against the limits of the architecture of the world, whether that's the forms of our built environment in our cities, or, the capacities of our planet, right? And I really loved sort of Arti's phrase, sensuous parkour, as a sort of way of gesturing to how sort of artistic practice can work at that edge. There are also questions of social structure that really struck with me, and this promise that's been sort of repeated over and over again that the digital is something separate and something new, which is a very old promise, as anyone who's sort of studied the internet knows. And it kind of stuck out to me that today, the last couple of days, it really struck me that that's not just branding, that's not just narrative, it's not just symbolic, but there seems to be sort of real kind of new affordances that emerge when network computation are layered onto our physical and social worlds. And that's both what's sort of giving us retrograde visions of the metaverse, but also precisely what yesterday Shabani was talking about, sort of these temporary manless sanctuaries that PUBG offers. And so there's like kind of these weird spaces that are emerging in unexpected places. In sort of national and transnational economic structures, I think Vladen, Ritam, Michaela, a whole lot of our speakers, Dan, highlighted at labor panel that there are sort of real unresolved questions about patterns of accumulation in countries like India, where sort of inequality is more rampant than ever. I think I've argued that we're going through what Gramsci's called a passive revolution, where sort of our Indian domestic tech capitalists are playing a central role in shaping the imaginaries of how the world will be restructured. And so I think that's another sort of site that's been here with all the mentions of Dipinder Goyal. And then finally, the question of the future, or the futures, right, which is not only a question of sort of economic, social, and political change, but I think, José kind of preempted me on this, but I also wanted to sort of bring up the question of cosmotechnics, though I couldn't have done it in nowhere near of an elegant way as you did. But sort of different visions and sort of structurations of the roles that technologies play in our lives. And I think this last panel really kind of offered, with its sort of provocations and prototypes of sort of slowness, of decomputing, of indigenous cosmotechnics, of disability, sort of offered us really powerful glimpses, not only into the future, but also I think into re-seeing our present and our pasts. And those are sort of realities that stick with us and that we need to protect, nurture, and build. And I will leave us with that. Thank you so much, everyone, for having joined us for the last couple of days.
Thank you very much for being a great audience, and I'd really like to take this opportunity to thank Mila for working so closely with us. I'd also like to thank very much the whole Goethe's team, Kanika and her team, Shweta and others, and the Khoj team, especially Gulmeher, who has worked tirelessly on this. I think all of you have known her, and the entire Khoj team. So thank you so much for everything. And do catch the exhibition for those of you who haven't. And yeah, thank you.